one of the reasons that I wrote the book is to try to, figure out how do we make mass torts work for the people who are deeply affected by these types of industries. So not just for the big corporations, not just for the plaintiffs' lawyers, not just for the defense lawyers, but for the everyday citizens who are affected by any kind of corporate misconduct.
Welcome to Ira's Everything Bagel, where I talk with intriguing people about everything, their passions, pursuits, and points of view. Please like, share, and subscribe. It really helps the channel, and I appreciate it. Late night TV promises justice with a phone call, but what happens after the commercial fades? On this episode of Ira's Everything Bagel, I talk with law professor and investigative author Elizabeth Chamblee Burch, whose explosive new book, The Pain Brokers, How Conmen, Call Centers, and Rogue Doctors Fuel America's Lawsuit Factory. It's a chilling, deeply human story of telemarketers, rogue doctors, and profit-driven lawyers, and of course, three women whose pain became someone else's payday. This is Selling the Dream meets Empire of Pain, and it raises urgent questions about who the legal and medical systems are really serving. The Pain Brokers, How Con Men, Call Centers, and Rogue Doctors Fuel America's Lawsuit Factory is available on Amazon, Barnes& and Noble, bookshop.org, and all the usual places. And for everything about Elizabeth, go to Elizabeth Chamblee Burch, that's Burch, elizabethchambleeburch.com. You can follow her on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and X. And Elizabeth, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
Thank you. What got you down this road? I mean, you're busy with academia, and at the same time, you're an investigative reporter. So there's so many things that you could look at. How did you start? Was this a personal situation that brought you to this point, or was it you just started noticing certain things going on?
A little bit of both, actually. I've been writing about these types of cases for 20 some odd years. These are cases that deeply affect the American public, everything from the opioid crisis to the BP oil spill. And then, of course, the subject of this book is pelvic mesh. But I had been writing for so long as a scholar, and so little changed, and it got to be a little frustrating. And so I went back to school. I got an MFA from our journalism school in narrative nonfiction, um, and began to do sort of a deep dive into this underworld of mass tort litigation. And the deeper I dove, the more I found, and it was just a pretty fascinating story.
What was the most surprising thing you found in your research? I'm not going to ask you what was the most depressing thing you found because there's a lot of that. But what was the most surprising thing that you found once you started your own research? You had read about it, you researched it, and you wrote about it, but now you're getting into a deeper dive. So was there one thing that just shook you when you got to that point?
Well, I always knew that there was a kind of an underbelly to this world that you see things on the surface. So you see lawyers who are in court, you see clients who are in court. But the prologue gives you a sense as to that first moment where I had my eyes opened. I went to a conference that was oddly named Mass Tort Made Perfect in Las Vegas. And in Las Vegas, I saw that there was a huge exhibit hall, and the exhibit hall included this huge network of people from third-party litigation funders to medical records keepers. It's just this huge conglomerate of people who profit from mass torts. And what I didn't realize is that that is very much a key to some of the seedy underbelly. And my first big tip-off was a call from a whistleblower who happened to be at that same conference, unbeknownst to me at the time. And he told me things that seemed too fantastical to be true. And yet, the more I dug in, the more I realized that there was, in fact, truth behind it.
Did he know you were at the conference, and that's how he was
He
able to?
did not.
Oh,
No, he called me actually a month and a half into my MFA program. So that started in 2021, and I was at the conference back in 2015. So it was a number of years later that we realized that we were in the same place at the same time.
so once you started to get information from this whistleblower, you realized there's a book here, and there's information that needs to get out. You centered around three women, Jerry, Barbara, and Sharon. And why were you anchoring everything along those lives of those three women versus a more general kind of approach?
Well, I wanted to tell a story about the people who have been affected by these types of cases. And many of the people that I talked with felt like they were just treated like a number on a spreadsheet. And so I very much wanted to bring some of those women to life. And these are real people. They are people who are deeply affected by the scam that I write about. They are also people who helped uncover that scam based on their own dogged research and their insistence that a lawyer take their case and being told no, no over and over and over again. And eventually all finding their way to the same young lawyer who was fresh out of law school in Arkansas, who was willing to take on a case that nobody else would.
Were you surprised that there are clearly villains? I'll use that in a generic sense. There are clearly villains to the story, but there's heroes to the story too. You just alluded to one just a moment ago. When you look at the whole industry and your experience at the convention, I would imagine just the fact that you see this amount of exhibit space filled with services and companies that alone tells you there's a market there.
Absolutely. It tells you there's a market there. I think, part of the concern is that these cases are being marketed and collected like you would collect baseball cards or sell and trade baseball cards, but these aren't, um, this isn't a form of, an equity. This is somebody's life. This is somebody who has been deeply injured and they feel like they have been injured by a particular company and they want to try to correct that harm in some way.
Did you find when you were talking to some of the people in the industry, was there some humanity behind the con? In other words, people that were involved in this, rogue doctors, as we mentioned, call centers, et cetera, and the pain brokers, which is the name of your book, the subtitle, How Conmen, Call Centers, and Rogue Doctors Fuel America's Lawsuit Factory. Are any of them, when you approach them in terms of just trying to get an interview or getting research, did any of them acknowledge that this was a market rather than humanity?
Very few of them did. I think they were able to justify it to themselves in a number of different ways. Some of the doctors claimed they didn't know, how the whole scheme operated. Some of the middlemen claimed that they were only helping women who didn't have insurance, which was clearly not the case. Every one of the women in the book that I write about had insurance and was told once they got down to South Florida at essentially what was an outpatient chiropractic clinic that insurance was not accepted. They were then forced to take out third-party liens against their future settlement proceeds. So a procedure that would have cost them between $800 to $1,000 if it was covered by insurance ended up costing between $60,000 and $120,000 to $150,000. But yes, I mean, they all had their reasons in terms of the quote unquote villains. And I try very much to portray those reasons in the book. I don't think anybody should be flattened to their one worst day. And so, I want the reader to understand where they were coming from, and I hope that I accomplished that.
Mhm. You mentioned about flying women into South Florida, this chiropractor's office, which still amazes me. But uh, if no insurance was available and they're coming from other states, wouldn't that take on the patina of a violation of a federal law or possibly, in other words, you're crossing state borders to commit potentially or allegedly fraud because they think they're coming there and the insurance is going to cover it and it's not going to cover it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are a number of legal violations. Many of them don't get prosecuted because the statute of limitations for some of these is quite short. And so by the time the scheme unravels, the statute of limitations has often run. But one of the ways that they tried to get around, for example, an anti-kickback law, which both Medicare and I understand Medicare and Medicaid both have, which means that doctors essentially can't pay for patients. But they got around that by refusing to take Medicare or Medicaid or any sort of private health insurance. So, the third party lending brought in, an extra party, but it also allowed them to skirt around some of the laws that might have eventually gotten them in trouble.
So they're not beholden to Medicare or any other federal insurance situation. Yeah, that's understandable. have you reached the point after writing the book where you feel you have to take an even more active role in the sense of lobbying for changes in either state or federal legislatures?
Yes and no. Part of I think, the frustration in the book is not necessarily, I mean, there are some loopholes in laws that need to be closed, but so much of this is not enforcing the law on the books. So much of this is the legal profession failing to regulate itself, the medical profession failing to regulate itself. So it's as much, I think, trying to advocate for these laws to be enforced as it is to try to close up loopholes in existing laws.
When you finished writing the book, did you want to get it into the hands of, for example, state legislators and federal legislators so they can see what's going on and perhaps move it on that end? In other words, was that in your mind when you wrote the book and when you finished it?
Absolutely. I was hoping to try to create change in this space. This is a world that is very insular and it tends to benefit the key stakeholders who are all very interested in keeping the status quo. They've all grown quite rich over it over the years. And so, one of the reasons that I wrote the book is to try to, figure out how do we make mass torts work for the people who are deeply affected by these types of industries. So not just for the big corporations, not just for the plaintiffs' lawyers, not just for the defense lawyers, but for the everyday citizens who are affected by any kind of corporate misconduct.
For our listeners and viewers, could you define a tort and why there is I guess, the mass tort litigation and how that differs from what we're seeing here with this factory setup?
Absolutely. So a tort is a harm. It's a punch, a kick, a car accident. A mass tort is a harm that happens to a whole lot of people in a similar way. So I gave a few examples earlier, like the opioid epidemic or the BP oil spill, any kind of pharmaceutical product that is alleged to have injured people in a similar way, or a medical device like pelvic mesh, which was failing inside of these women. And the way that those cases are handled at the federal level is that they are consolidated in front of a single judge for purposes of pretrial handling. And I think the problem with that is, while on the one hand it's efficient and efficient mainly for the corporations, the people tend to get lost in the shuffle. They come into court, they think, I'm going to have a chance to have my Perry Mason moment, my Matlock moment. I'm going to be able to speak truth to power. And that just doesn't happen. Trials are very rare, and I think it's really frustrating for the people who have been involved in these types of cases.
Are you starting to hear from people who have got that you have not been aware of before, but have been reading the book and contacting you and saying, I'm that person.
I
I'm one of
have.
those women.
Yeah, they are starting to come out. Many of them are people that I have been in touch with before. I did a procedural justice study a number of years ago trying to talk to plaintiffs in the mass tort system to figure out, how do you feel like your lawyer treated you? How do you feel like your judge treated you? And many of those women had been injured by pelvic mesh. So a lot of this is them reaching back out after a number of years and saying, I read the book. I was contacted by these people. I either did go or I didn't go. And, I think it's, for some of them, it's eye-opening because they realize what they avoided, or for some of them, they realize, exactly what it is that they went through.
Just for those of us who may not know what a pelvic mesh is, it probably wouldn't hurt to explain it to our audience as well.
Absolutely. So pelvic mesh is a device that is used to shore up sagging pelvic organs. So as we age, everything goes south, including bladders and urethras and everything else. So it's mainly dealt with urinary incontinence, either because of prolapsed organs or because of stress urinary incontinence. It has been removed from the market for pelvic organ prolapse, but it is still on the market for stress urinary incontinence. And the difficulty is it's supposed to, sort of form this protective hammock, which shores everything up. And the scar tissue forms, a way to keep everything in place. But the difficulty is when it is removed, it's never meant to actually be removed. So it's sort of like putting rebar in concrete. It's meant to go in, it's never meant to go out. And so, as you can imagine, these doctors who are removing 5 meshes in a single day, some of whom were bragging about taking it out in 15 minutes, weren't necessarily doing the best job. Mesh removals can take between 7 and 8 hours when done right. It's a very delicate process. It's intertwined with organs in a way that can hurt the people that have them.
How did the telemarketing call centers get involved in all of this? In other words, I referenced it in the beginning when we talked about if you're watching late night television and then someone calls and now they're going to get a telemarketing center. But how did it all start, or were you able to trace the origin of this?
I was. So this was with the help of the whistleblower. But the three women at the heart of the book each received phone calls, and the caller on the other end of the line had an inordinate amount of medical information about them. They knew their names, their implant dates, their hospitals, their doctors, their birthdays, you name it. And they had gotten that information through a data breach in India. So when private health insurance companies outsourced their records keeping, the Indian call centers that were handling that information realized that they were sitting on a gold mine. And they teamed up with an outfit down in South Florida and began cold calling the women and telling them, you have a ticking time bomb in you. You have to have this removed immediately or you're going to die. And so, very frightening phone calls for the women. Some of the women actually thought that the phone calls came from the mesh manufacturers, that they were calling and recalling the product. Like you might get a postcard in the mail saying, hey, you have a car part that is being recalled, come by our service station and we'll take care of it. So for them, it made sense when they got down to South Florida and they wouldn't accept their insurance that it was all being handled by the mesh maker.
How much and it is not meant to sound callous or cold, but how much responsibility is on the patient who reacts to this without maybe checking it out and making sure that this is a legit situation?
I think it was difficult for the women. The callers were well equipped to deal with any kind of objections that the women had. So, if the women said, well, I need to check with my local doctor, then they would say, oh, well, you can do that. But a lot of the local doctors don't understand what's happening with this. We're on the cutting edge of this. There's only a few doctors in the country who are able to remove the mesh. We're the ones who are taking care of it. Or they would say, well, do you have all these different pains? And they'd say yes. And they would say, well, does your doctor take those pains seriously? And I think for a lot of the women, they felt like their implanting doctors did not take their pelvic pain seriously. That kind of pain, I think, had been regularly dismissed by a host of doctors. So the callers were well equipped to feed into that.
It almost sounds diabolical in a sense because they had access to all the information and they had the objections all worked out. In other words, it's almost like a boiler room operation where you call and sell something and people have objections and they know all the answers to the objections. It
Mhm.
just has that flavor to it.
It absolutely does. In fact, the whistleblower called it like a Wall Street boiler room operation, and he said
Yeah,
it was magnificent.
it's amazing. Were you able to, in your research, find at least one or two of these people that were heavily involved in this, either from the doctor point of view or call center point of view or any other element of this operation that, and I alluded to it earlier, but who just said to you, yeah, we know what we're doing is a little sketchy, but we're still going to do it because it makes a lot of money. In other words, was there any recognition by anybody about the impact on people?
Apart from my whistleblower, no. They were out there, they were making money, they justified it to themselves. They said, "Oh, we're helping these women. These are women who wouldn't have access to healthcare without us," which they knew was simply not true. So, there wasn't any kind of reckoning that I saw in terms of admissions or apologies.
Well, there's access to it, but they're paying for it because they're taking out a loan because the insurance doesn't cover it. So I'm not quite sure how that ties in. In other words, their answer doesn't make sense. But then again, I'm sure you came across a lot of that
Yeah,
situation.
and there was a lot of finger pointing back and forth. So, this is um, they created a whole bunch of different entities, and these different entities, they would say, "Oh, well, this is the surgical outfit that is responsible for this, or this is someone else who is responsible for that." And so, when it came to asking questions and trying to get answers, it was all a lot of let's point fingers at one another.
Do you think you, because you're now on promoting the book and you finally finished it, and it's a whole other exercise in promoting the book as well, that you're going to try to make an attempt to appear before conferences and spread the word that way, as well as interviews such as this? In other words, that you get it out to people that perhaps it's a medical conference and may not be a conference of these particular specialists, but just a generalized medical conference where you can raise awareness in terms of their approach to it.
Absolutely, I hope so. We actually have a new medical center that is starting up at the University of Georgia and taking its first class next year. And so I've had conversations with doctors who are professors there, and we're trying to figure out how to incorporate some of that into that curriculum. And I'm always happy to speak with anybody who would like to hear more about it.
But I was also thinking medical associations throughout the United States as well, that if they have a state association meeting somewhere, that you could be a speaker and talk about this issue,
That's a fabulous idea. Yeah.
as well as lawyers too. I mean, there's some, although that you may give them some ideas and they may want to join that situation. No offense to lawyers, but it just there's an interesting phenomenon that's been going on for I don't know how long at this point, 30, 40 years of lawyers advertising on television, which I again talked about in the beginning, where you see these lawyers willing to represent you for this, that, and everything. And I don't know, I just think if there's a way of educating people so they really check things out before they just respond to an ad on television. Now, true, because someone's in pain, they're gonna sometimes just grab whatever they can find that's going to hope to alleviate the pain or promise to alleviate the pain. Doesn't always work, but that may be the thing as well. When you put the information together, were you, this is more an emotional question, I guess. Were you, when you finished the book, you had done the research, you knew a lot of it beforehand as well. You got the tip off from the whistleblower. Were you exhausted or depressed by finishing the book and realizing what the problem is here?
Um, yes and no. I mean, this is a space that I have been in for a lot of years, and it's frustrating not to see any change. And so I think more than anything at that point, I was hopeful that this might actually spark some of these conversations about how we can create this much needed change. So even though a lot of the book is, dealing with difficult subjects and, dealing with people who were made worse off by these surgeries, I'm hopeful that all of that will come to some good.
Of the three women that you spotlight in the book, how are you able to get their cooperation and buy-in into the project? I mean, I could see why they would, but I'd rather let you explain it rather than me just to suppose how they did it.
Yeah, so I started with J.R. Baxter, who I mentioned as our young hero in Arkansas. And by the time I got involved in the story, he was already representing Jerry, Sharon, and Barb.
Mhm.
And so I started off asking, would you be willing to let me talk with Jerry? And so I talked with her. And, at that point, I was still trying to figure out who my main characters would be, who could tell different parts of the story. And Jerry could tell one part of the story, but not other parts of the story. And so I kept asking JR, well, who else should I talk to? Who else should I talk to? And so eventually I met with Sharon and Barb, and it is a process of building that trust, particularly for people who have been treated in the way that they were. And so it took some time to be able to try to build those relationships.
Was there any relief for those three women?
Yes and no. They both had multiple surgeries afterwards to try to deal with the incontinence that was created by the surgery to fix the fix. But Jerry is still very much in diapers, incontinent. She is afraid to leave her motel room. She's terrified to go out into the world. So it's been, I think, a really depressing and frustrating experience for them.
I want to go back to something else that is more generalized based on your experience with these three women. You argue that women's pain is sometimes or routinely dismissed or monetized in terms of the overall the book, but I think that's a case too in terms of a lot of times people go to their doctor and they say that there's a women particularly we're talking about here that there's an issue with pain. Is that a problem that's continuing even in today's world? Because that was an issue 30, 40 years ago, maybe 50 years ago, where women would go to a doctor and say, I'm in pain or I'm suffering this, and the doc would say, I don't know, take two aspirin, call me in the morning, that type of thing. I'm exaggerating, but you know what I'm saying. So now we're in 2026. Has that improved, or are we still at that point where women will say something to a doctor and the doctor will not understand what the issue is?
I think that there has been some improvement there. Certainly, there are still doctors who are like that. I think in general, medicine is made for men. It's tested mostly in men. Men are the sort of, the norm for all the testing. Um, but I think that that is starting to change, and these conversations are starting to change. I was at my doctor's office a few weeks ago, and they were offering new forms of pain relief just for things like IUD insertions. So I think we are starting to see some changes there.
What would you like people to take away if there are three main points from, we have a few minutes left, but what would be the three main things you would like people to take away from reading your book, which is again, it's a fascinating subject, the pain brokers. What would you say are the top three? Or if you don't have top three, maybe the top two.
Sure. I mean, I think, the first thing is to educate yourself before you were ever to undergo any kind of surgery. So, we talked about, is there any sort of fault here for the women? I would argue there's not a fault for the women, but there is maybe a red flag, particularly that they had so much medical information about the women beforehand and the urgency behind it, this has to happen now or it can't happen at all. So anytime something like that happens, to take the time to evaluate it. Um, the second is to become your own best advocate. So if you feel like something isn't quite right, then, speaking up, saying something, doing something proactive, trying to get information out there. And if you think that you might be the victim of a scam, then saying something and speaking up and reporting it so that maybe you can stop it in its tracks. And I guess the third thing is just, hoping to start these conversations about how we begin to close loopholes in a system that would allow something like this to happen, whether it is regulatory enforcement where enforcement has failed, or whether it's creating new laws that deal with third-party litigation funding with these medical liens towards patients.
Well, that's a great way to leave it. My guest has been Elizabeth Chamblee Burch. She's author of The Pain Brokers: How Conmen, Call Centers, and Rogue Doctors Fuel America's Lawsuit Factory. It's available on Amazon, Barnes& and Noble, bookshop.org, and all the usual places. And for everything about Elizabeth, go to Elizabeth Chamblee Burch. It's Burch, elizabethchambleeburch.com. And you can follow her on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Elizabeth, thanks for being on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
You got it. And join us every Thursday for a new schmear on Ira's Everything Bagel.